Doctor, would you voluntarily play a game if you knew the rule said you always lose? Of course not. Yet physicians play that game every day, not because we choose to, because those are the rules when you are sued. I learned that lesson after a 3-year malpractice lawsuit. I walked out of arbitration having prevailed. There was no judgment. There was no payment. Legally, I had won. Emotionally, it didn't feel that way. There was no joy in Mudville. My attorney saw it, and in an effort to validate my experience, he said, in lawsuits, even when you win, you lose. He was absolutely right. Today, I want to share some lessons I learned from being sued, from serving as a medical expert, and from helping other physicians navigate one of the most painful experiences in medicine. Hi, if we haven't met, I'm Dr. Vicki Rackner. I'm a retired surgeon and the founder of Thriving Doctors. I've learned that the hardest part of a lawsuit is rarely the legal process. It's what happens inside the physician going through it. I was a surgical resident when I was involved with what I call my starter lawsuit. My husband and I were in the kitchen eating dinner, and out the window we saw somebody back into our driveway. The driver left the engine running, left the car door open, and rang the bell. My husband answered. This guy said, "Is Vicki Rackner here?" My husband called me down. The guy said to me, "Are you Vicki Rackner?" And once I said yes, he handed me an envelope and said 4 words I will never forget. He said, "You have been served." We went back into the kitchen. I opened the envelope and started reading. I was being sued. However, it was hard for me to make sense of this legal document. So I handed the papers to my husband and I saw his eyes get wide as saucers. He said, "It's not just that you are being sued. The paper says Vicki Rackner, MD, and her marital community are being sued. We are being sued." Now, intellectually, I understood that lawsuits are just an occupational hazard of being a doctor. But I had never really thought through this and understood it didn't just impact me. It impacted my husband too. He had a business. Could he lose everything? So that night, we went through the what ifs. What if we lost? What if we lost everything? What if I was unwilling to deal with this risk in the future and maybe not even practice medicine? I was dismissed from this lawsuit within a couple of weeks. But those couple of weeks left a big impact on me. But a few years later, I faced what I call my big girl lawsuit. I was no longer a resident. I owned and ran my own practice. The buck stopped with me. So there was no attending to turn to, no institution standing between me and the claim. This lawsuit lasted 3 years. And that's the lawsuit that taught me the lessons I'm sharing today. The first lesson is this: being sued does not mean you are a bad doctor. I know this sounds obvious. It wasn't obvious to me at the time. Bad outcomes are not the same thing as malpractice. Medicine is uncertain. Complications happen. Terrible outcomes occur despite excellent care. Good doctors get sued. Excellent doctors get sued. Careful doctors get sued. If you only take away one thing from today's episode, let it be this: being sued is not proof that you are a bad doctor. The second lesson is that patients don't always sue because they want money. One of the most meaningful experiences I had involved being a medical expert, consulting on a case of a woman dying from gallbladder cancer. Now, this woman believed that there had been a delay in diagnosis. Well, I reviewed the records carefully and I found no violation of the standard of care. This was one of those heartbreaking situations where medicine had done its best and still failed to produce the outcome everyone wanted. We've all seen those things happen. The attorney called his client and then he said, "My client is crestfallen." She said, "Now I'll never have a chance to tell my story and learn from my doctors exactly what happened and why." So I made an offer. I would come meet with her. I brought my anatomy book and my surgical atlas, and most importantly, my listening ears. I let her tell her story in her own words, in her own time. I answered her questions. I explained what we knew and what we didn't know. But most importantly, I listened. And at the end of the conversation, she said, "Thank you. Now I can die in peace." That experience changed me. Patients don't always sue because they want money. They want answers. They want understanding. Many want acknowledgement. Many simply want to be heard. And let's just tell the truth. When our patients are having a bad outcome, we don't want to linger in the patient's room. The patients experience withdrawing, and some interpret that as evidence of guilt. The third lesson is that secrecy breeds shame. One of the most difficult aspects of litigation is isolation. Now, if you've ever been sued, you know that you are advised to be extremely careful about not discussing the case. The legal reasons are understandable, but the emotional consequences are profound. Well, during my 3-year big girl lawsuit, I went to a very dark place. I sought therapy, and it just so happens that my therapist also had several other women physicians who were also being sued. And she noticed something. She noticed that the secrecy surrounding litigation was creating shame. Doctors were suffering alone. They thought that they were the only ones. And she offered a brilliant solution. Individually, she checked in with us and said, "Hey, what if we form a consulting group? We each pay each other $1. Then we are the hired consultants. We could now just talk about the human experience of being sued." Now we had a safe place to share what we were going through and seeing that we were not, in fact, alone. So this wasn't about discussing legal strategies or the details of the case. This was about how we were processing the circumstances over which we had no control. After my lawsuit, I realized we doctors trust our patients too. We trust them to tell us the truth. We trust them to partner with us. We trust them to work toward a similar goal. But this lawsuit felt like a betrayal, not just legally, but within the context of a relationship. And it left me with 2 difficult questions. First, how could I trust the next patient? And perhaps more importantly, how could I trust myself? For a while, I became much more suspicious of patients, more guarded, more aware of the risks. The challenge is becoming wiser without becoming cynical. Looking back, I can see that I contributed to this patient filing the lawsuit, not because I violated the standard of care, but because I failed to document an important phone call that this patient made to me after hours when I was out of the office. And I didn't have a system to document those calls. The 5th lesson is about boundaries. When this patient first came to see me on a Friday afternoon, he told me a story about how every physician had failed him, how he was victimized by the medical system. As a young doctor, I remember thinking, this guy has had some really tough breaks. Then I thought, I will be the doctor who turns this around. The lawsuit taught me to pay attention to patterns. Patients tell you who they are with their actions. If a patient is telling you about the long list of people who have let them down and victimized them, it is only going to be a question of time before you join that naughty list. Personally, I decided that I was not going to take any patient who was always in these complex triangulated relationships in which there was always an angel and there was a devil. Are there boundaries that you might want? Do you have a certain kind of patient that you'd really rather say no to? Finally, treat yourself kindly. A lawsuit is not a sprint, it's a marathon. Mine lasted 3 years. 3 years of uncertainty, 3 years of waiting, 3 years of wondering what would happen next. If you're sued, fear is normal. Anger is normal. Sadness is normal. Shame is normal. A sense of betrayal is normal. The goal isn't to avoid those feelings. The goal is to move through them. Before I close, I want to make one thing clear. Everything I shared today has focused on the emotional and human side of litigation. That doesn't mean that the practical side doesn't matter. It does matter. You should work with qualified professionals to make sure that you have appropriate malpractice coverage, disability coverage, liability protection, cybersecurity safeguards, and a thoughtful asset protection strategies. One of the biggest mistakes I see physicians make is assuming that the only lawsuit they need to worry about is medical litigation. And that's simply not true. Sometimes I sort of felt like there was a bullseye on my lab coat with a sign that said, "Sue me." Sometimes the greatest risks come from places we never anticipated. Take the case of a 70-year-old dermatologist. Now, he had complete financial security, but he continued to practice medicine because he loved it, not because he had to. Well, one day he sent his office manager out to pick up sandwiches for the crew. Unfortunately, she was involved in a devastating car accident. All parties were insured, but the other party sought legal advice. Well, he discovered that the driver had been on the doctor's errand. Suddenly, the physician was pulled into the lawsuit. The risk wasn't medical. The risk was business related, and the consequences were devastating. The physician who had continued working because he wanted to now found himself working because he had to. The lesson isn't to live in fear. The lesson is to recognize that malpractice is only one source of liability. Good doctors get sued. Good doctors suffer. Good doctors recover. And good doctors go on to build meaningful lives on the other side. At Thriving Doctors, we believe that thriving isn't about avoiding adversity. It's about developing the skills, tools, and resilience to move through adversity without losing yourself in the process. I'm just curious, have you yourself been sued? What did you learn through the process? Please feel welcome to leave your thoughts in a comment below. I'll see you in the next video.